Welcome to Deltek Insight. This session is on accounts payable soup to nuts for Costpoint. My name is Laura Davis. I'm an executive member of PDS Consulting Solutions. I am a long-term Deltek user and a Costpoint user since the mid-1990s as a beta user. In this session, we're going to cover several areas such as control files, looking at the accounts payable and cash accounts, the vendor master file, the accounts payable voucher, payment processing, some reporting and inquiry, and just a few other areas. When we look at the control file, the accounts payable module has several areas to focus on. We'll dive a bit deeper into vendor settings and vendor terms, the accounts payable settings, check settings, the voucher settings, and we'll look at our cash accounts and accounts payable accounts. So as we go into configure vendor settings, as you can see our path across the top, first of all, we have the ability to assign our vendor number automatically by checking this box. If we check this box every time we create a new vendor and save the record, it will increment that vendor number by 1. If this is unchecked, you manually assign the vendor ID as you create the vendor in the vendor master file. The next area is for pay vendor. If you choose to voucher to one vendor and pay to another, you will need to check this pay vendor, allow vendor, different pay vendor checkbox. This can also will need to be checked in the vendor master file. The next section looks at default accounts, and these are defaults only. You can set a default accounts payable account and a default operating account, and these can be changed at the vendor level and at the voucher level. The remaining section is related to subcontractor management and vendor employee labor. We are not going to cover those in this session. The next screen we're taking a look at are vendor terms. The system does come pre-configured with a few vendor terms such as net 15, net 30. You can add any new terms that fit your vendor's requirements, giving it a description. If it's based on the number of days, looking at the invoice or the receipt or the transaction. And is it based on number of days, day of month, or range of days, and if there's any discounts applied. Once this is assigned to the vendor, it will automatically calculate the due date of the invoice. The next screen is configure accounts payable settings. Generally, there's not a lot to change in this screen, but we have the default aging criteria, which controls how the open AP is printed and how your vendor invoices are aged. We also have some payment information related to EFT. We can set limits on approval limits on checks, that if a check goes over a certain dollar amount, there must be a lender approval process requiring vendor approval, and the bottom section there is for subcontractor management. Likewise, configure check settings. You can require 1 or 2 signatures. You can require the second signature if over a certain dollar amount. As many of you know, that there is a bitmap file that can be attached to automatically print the signature on the checks. The next section is how do you want the checks address to print on the check, 1099 information, how you want the date to show, and what you want to show on part 3 of the laser check. There's also a positive pay area in the bottom right-hand corner. Configure accounts payable voucher settings. This is for accounts payable vouchers, not purchase order vouchers, which we are not covering. The voucher numbering method is generally set to system generated, where the system will automatically assign the next voucher number to the voucher as it's saved. That is best practice, and it will track the last voucher number used. You can check the manual where you assign your own voucher number. You can require approval of AP vouchers, or you can set a limit that they must be approved if the voucher is over a certain dollar amount. You can also choose whether to allow duplicate invoice numbers. Generally, best practice prescribes that you do not allow duplicate invoice numbers or that you run the duplicate invoice number report. If you are subject to multiple sales tax codes, you can put the default sales tax code in here. If you are generally not taxable, you could set that as not taxable as well. And the remaining portion is intercompany work orders and in discounts. Let's take another look at the accounts payable and cash account screens. We can have multiple cash accounts that are applied to the checks. This cash account must be set up in the cash management screen and have a bank abbreviation. In this screen, we are adding a cash account description. We are assigning the general ledger account, the org from the general ledger, and the bank abbreviation from the cash management side. As we noticed in one of the control screens, that we can set a default cash account, but we can also set this at the vendor level, and it can be changed at the voucher level and up to the payment process. Likewise, we have manage accounts payable accounts. These are the accounts payable control accounts. You can have multiple of these as well, and they are assigned at the vendor level. However, once the voucher is created and posted, this cannot be changed. You will give it the accounts payable account description. You will link it to the general ledger account and the general ledger org. Many companies will have several, but you must control these and monitor how you print your open AP report if multiple AP accounts are used. And in addition to check printing, we have the ACH setup. This works closely with the cash management side, and the setup is done in the cash management. And while many banks are similar, the requirements for the ACH file layout can vary slightly between banks. So you do want to work with your bank on getting an acceptable Nacha file layout. Create a test file that is approved by the bank. Here's a sample of what the screen looks like, where you will actually set up the ACH file layout. Next, we're going to take a look at the vendor master file. There's a lot of information in the vendor master file, and a lot of the information is required. When you set up a new vendor, you will give it a name, and if that name is not long enough for that field, you can use the long name to expand that field, and that can be printed on checks. You can identify the vendor status as active, give a warning, or inactive. If it is a payroll vendor where you are processing payroll taxes or payroll deductions, you will select it as a payroll vendor. Moving to the middle section, you can group your vendors for reporting purposes. If this is a customer in the accounts receivable side, you can link this to that customer. And likewise, if this is an employee, you can link this vendor to the employee ID. If this vendor is going to be using the expense module, you can link this vendor to their expense class. And there's other information that you can track, such as the DUNS number and the cage code. To the far right is your 1099 information. And you do need to identify a vendor during setup as to whether they will receive a 1099 and what is the type. You will want to go ahead and get their tax ID, and if the name on the 1099 will differ from either the name or the long name, you will need to note it here. Please note that when a voucher is processed or created, it will use the default 1099 status from this screen. So if the vendor is not set to 1099 status and should require one, each voucher up until that point will not be set as 1099. We also have the defaults tab. This is where we can set the pay vendor. In one of the earlier control screens, we had allowed different pay to vendor, and this is where we would set who would be the optional pay to vendor. We can allow edits to that pay to vendor on the voucher. We set our terms. We can elect to pay this vendor when we're paid by our customer. If you're using the purchasing module, you can choose to auto voucher this vendor. You can choose to print a separate check if there are multiple vouchers for the same vendor. And then moving to the right, we have our accounts payable account and our operating account. We also have our address below. Each vendor can have multiple addresses, and each address can be for payment or order if you're using the purchase order module. You can have a default payment address or just a regular payment address. You can also input an email address in this area so that ACH remittance invoices can be emailed. Notice to the right that we have the ACH information that is active, and then we have the ACH information at the bottom of the screen. If you click on the ACH information, you will enter the bank routing number, which must have already been configured in the cash management screen. This will be the vendor's bank ID, and you'll select whether it is a live checking or savings account and whether to print the EFT advice. So we're going to take a look now at an accounts payable voucher. And we'll be looking at certain things like the voucher number, the invoice number, how the system ages our invoice for payment, amounts, discounts, check information, and recurring. As I said, the system will auto number the voucher if that was selected in the control screen. You will input your fiscal year period and subperiod and select your vendor. The system will automatically populate the vendor terms, which can be changed. You will move further down into the header information and put the vendor invoice number and the invoice date. At that point, the system will calculate the due date to the right-hand side. You will input the voucher amount, and the AP account and the cash account will populate based what is in the vendor master file. If discounts apply, they will show in the area above. Moving to the Details tab of the voucher, if there's any value-added tax information, if there's any retainage, you can also reference an external purchase order. This is not a Costpoint generated purchase order. This is a purchase order from an external system. If this is a recurring voucher, you can put the information about the recurring voucher. You can tell the system to hold this particular voucher. If the vendor has been set to a pay when paid, you can also identify the pay when paid. And you can also set a separate check if multiple vouchers are payable to the same vendor. Moving across, we now have the Address tab. If there are multiple addresses for this vendor, you can choose which address will go to that vendor, or if there's a joint pay to. If you are choosing to pay this voucher or have paid this voucher previous to vouchering it, if it was an electronic payment or an automatic draft from the bank, you can record the check at the same time as you record the voucher. You will input the check number, the check date, the amount, and the fiscal year period and subperiod that the check was paid. This does not necessarily have to be the same period that the voucher is recorded in. If this is a recurring voucher, you will identify what the recurring code is, such as weekly, monthly, etc., And is there a date range that this recurring is effective? If this is left blank, it will recur indefinitely. So after we've completed the header of the voucher, now it's time to input our voucher distribution. And this is where we identify our account, org, and project, the dollar amount, any notes, and we can update our 1099 information. So we will add a new line, and we will select our general ledger account, our organization, and our project. At that point, we can choose to enter our dollar amount, or we could also enter a percentage of the invoice amount, and the system will calculate the cost amount for us. The description will default to the general ledger account number. However, we can override that with a more detailed description, which is highly recommended because this will show on your general ledger detail and is very helpful in any analysis on a general ledger account. As I mentioned, if the vendor was set to be a 1099 vendor, the vendor 1099 will be checked as a default. If this is a 1099 vendor and there is an amount that you're paying that should not be recorded on a 1099, you can uncheck this. But this choice is made at the time of the voucher and must carefully be monitored. So once we have input our vouchers, saved our vouchers, we go through an edit process. It's highly recommended that you review your voucher edit, and you will want to save some parameters related to how you print this voucher edit. And then we're going to look at voucher distribution posting. So with our voucher edit, as I said, you will want to save a parameter for the way that you generally run this. There may be multiple parameters depending on how you want to look at this. You can choose to print by vendor, by voucher. You can even select to print the edit just for certain Costpoint users. If there are multiple accounts payable personnel, you can choose just to print the edits that you input. You will choose your fiscal year and your period. It can be a range of periods or all periods. You must select a voucher type, and you can only select one voucher type. So if you are doing accounts payable and purchase order vouchers, you can only print the edits for one or the other. Likewise, if you have expense reports from time and expense, you can only print those separately. And if there are payroll vouchers, those must be printed separately. Moving over to the right, you can also choose to print your account names, if you're using reference numbers, any tax information, and line notes. At the bottom, if you have recorded any checks on the vouchers, you will want to select paid as well as unpaid. If a voucher has a check recorded in the voucher screen and the paid is not checked, the edit will not pick that voucher up. If you are using voucher approval, you may choose to select approved or unapproved voucher status. And if you're doing recurring vouchers, you can choose as to which ones that you will print. In the bottom right-hand corner, you can choose your primary sort, and if you choose to do a page break after that sort. Once you have reviewed your vouchers and you are comfortable that everything is correct, it's time to post the vouchers to the general ledger. This posting process not only posts to the general ledger, but it also posts to the accounts payable subsidiary ledger. This may be a screen that you also want to set a parameter, but you will choose the period that you are posting in, and you can only post to one period, unlike the voucher edit that you can print multiple periods. You have a lot of other options to filter. You can choose a certain cash account, a certain org. If there are multiple accounts payable personnel entering vouchers, you can choose just to post one user's vouchers. You can even post a particular vendor or a particular voucher. At the very bottom, you will choose what type of voucher that you are posting. Unlike the voucher edit, you can check all of these. It is not limited to just one voucher type in the posting screen. It is best practice to print the voucher posting journal, look at the journal, save a copy of the journal before hitting the gears to post. Once you have posted, that does hit the general ledger and does leave an audit trail if those vouchers are reversed. Next, we'll move on to payment processing. And this is looking at the checks first of all. We have a few ways to select our vouchers. We can do it as a mass selection or an individual selection. We're going to look at saving parameters for the different payment types, pre-printed check stock or blank check stock. Talk about the important clicking on the process button to retain the information, and we'll briefly look at manual checks. So our first option is to do a mass selection of any vouchers that meet the certain criteria. Generally, a user in this case will tell the system to go out and find any vouchers that have a due date as of a certain date and before. This is an easy, quick way to select your vouchers. However, it could miss something that needs to be paid that falls outside of that due date. So it may require some additional review and analysis of the outstanding vouchers. There are other criteria that can be selected, such as the user ID or vendor and voucher. Once you have set this, you will hit the gears and it will go change the pay status for any vouchers that meet this criteria from hold to pay. If for any reason you select this in error, to the right where under options and process, that can also be changed to put those vouchers back on hold. Another option to voucher selection is an individual voucher selection. This is a little more time consuming, but it is a little more detailed. You will come into the screen and you can either choose just a particular pay vendor, or if that's left blank, you will hit the lightning bolt to execute and it will retrieve all outstanding vouchers. If you did input a particular pay vendor and hit the lightning bolt, you will just see the outstanding vouchers for that particular vendor. You will see a lot of information about the voucher. You will see the status, whether it's set to pay or to hold. You will see the amount to pay. If for some reason you choose not to pay the voucher in full, you can put a different amount that will default to the outstanding amount. You can choose to put in something different. At this point, you have some options to change your address code. If for some reason you know that the check needs to be mailed to a different address, you can change it at this point. If the vendor was set to an EFT status of active, it's going to show that this is a pay method of EFT. If the EFT status is not active, it will default to a check. This can only be controlled in the vendor master file and cannot be changed in the screen. If you have multiple vouchers to the same vendor and you want those to print on separate checks, you have another opportunity to make that selection now and put those on different checks. You still have the opportunity to change which cash account up to this point. If for some reason you're looking at a voucher and you want to learn more about the voucher, at the bottom you have other information such as voucher detail, voucher totals, PO details, etc. Once you've made your selections, you will save this screen. That time, it is time to print your checks. Many people will print a pre-payment edit report prior to processing the checks. It just validates all the vouchers that you selected previously and can be a control report for someone to review and approve. It is highly recommended that you set parameters for each type of payment processing. As you can see in the drop-down, we have a test check, we have printing a physical check, non-negotiable copies. As you'll see in a few minutes, we can void our checks in the screen. We will also print and void our EFTs in the screen and process our zero balance checks. So it is recommended that you have a parameter for each one of these activities, at least, to simplify the process. Once you have identified that you will print the check, you will identify the check type, whether that's pre-printed check stock or blank check stock. You can tell the system how to sort the checks, either by vendor ID or by vendor name. You're going to tell the system what period these checks are posted in, and this should correlate with the check date. If the check date falls outside of this fiscal year period and subperiod, you will get a warning letting you know that. You can also choose to print the checks or select by bank abbreviation or by the account org combination. You remember back to the control screen where we set up our cash accounts, those are tied together. So you're getting the same results, just different choice of whether to choose the bank abbreviation or the account org combination. You will set your check date and your starting check number. The system does remember the previous check run and should have that as the correct check number. If you are printing the signature on the checks, this information will already be checked where that file location is and what is the file name of the signature. Once you have all this selected, you will print, and an Adobe file will populate for your checks to print on check stock. Once you have printed your checks and everything is correct, you must click Process at the top and update tables from pre-printed laser checks advices. If you do not perform this step and exit the screen, the system will not know that the checks have been printed for this particular voucher, and they will be available to print again. So do not forget to run the update tables. Likewise, if we're processing ACH payments, as I've said, I do recommend saving a parameter on how this should look. Print your prepayment edit. Your vendor master must have the EFT active flag. You will save this ACH file to an alternate file location that you must have access to upload to the bank. So we will create the file and we'll print our advices. So this is the payment processing for ACH. As I said, you should save a parameter. You will select your bank abbreviation, your taxable entity, and the other information are things that you will have identified based on your bank requirements as to the EFT transfer type, the format type, and the transfer code. Each time you process ACHs, the bottom section under file information will change. Your effective date will change, your ACH file number will change, your location should stay the same. Once you have this information populated, you will hit the gears and the system will process the ACH. In order to download the ACH file, you will click on Process and File Download. After you have downloaded the file and you have uploaded to the bank, it's time to print your ACH advices. Very similar to printing checks, it's the same screen. You will have a unique parameter ID for printing EFT advices. Generally, those are printed on blank stock. Again, the period must correlate with the check date, and you can set an advice number that the system will print. Likewise, you must click Process and update the tables for this screen as well, or the system will not know that those have been printed and finalized. At this point, the subsidiary ledger is updated with the payment, but the general ledger is not. If you determine that you must void a check, You will do it from the same screen. It was where you print your checks and your ACH advices, but the checks must be posted, and that voucher will go back into the Open AP, and you will have to post the voided check as a cash disbursement file. So we're back in the print void check screen, and this time we choose void EFT advices or void checks. We're going to identify what is the period and fiscal year and what is the check date and the starting check number. You will hit the gears and the system will void the check. You'll hit the process button. Void check /EFT. At this point, the voucher is sitting back in the Open Accounts Payable screen to record another check or reverse the voucher. After you had printed your checks, processed your ACH advices, or voided checks, it's time to post your cash disbursement. Up until this point, your general ledger and your accounts payable ledger may be out of balance because the general ledger has not seen the posting of these checks where the accounts payable ledger has. The cash disbursement journal is specific to an accounting period. As I mentioned, you want to review the journal before posting and retain a copy of that journal. If you have done any manual checks, these will also be recorded on the cash disbursement posting. If you record any unusable checks, those will also be on the cash disbursement posting. Don't forget to hit the gears. That's a very common mistake I see, that you've printed your report, you've saved your report, but you forgot to hit the gears before exiting the screen. So you can choose the period that you're posting the checks, and you can even choose to post an individual check, certain users' checks, a certain cash account. Again, print the report, review it, save it before you hit the gears. So there's a few reports in the Accounts Payable module. There's a vendor listing, or you can also print a vendor information report that is much more detailed. You have your Open Accounts Payable account, which is a very important report for month-end closing to reconcile to the general ledger. That can be printed in various different ways, so you will definitely want to save a parameter for that, and maybe multiple parameters depending on your needs. The cash requirements report and the voucher register and also check register. All of these reports can be printed after the month is closed, so you may be able to retrieve them at a later date if not printed during the closing process. There's some inquiry screens to inquire by check, vendor, or voucher, and each of these inquiry screens have the drill-through capability to get back to the original entry, such as the voucher detail. A few other areas I like to point out: there is a pay when paid functionality that generally works more with subcontractors, that you do not want to pay your vendor until you are paid by your customer. You must select this on the Accounts Payable Vendor Master File, but also in the Billing Master File under Projects. The project must be a cost plus or a time and materials where the transactions are billed for the system to know when you have been paid by your customer in order to pay the vendor. You have the ability and the option to turn on approvals for setting up a new vendor. This would mean that one person sets up the vendor, but that vendor cannot be used until someone else approves it. As we noticed, we can set approvals for vouchers or vouchers over a certain dollar amount, and for checks and or checks over a certain dollar amount. We have the ability to create recurring vouchers that can be processed on a particular frequency. We discussed our 1099 processing, which works very well. You just need to be very careful in setting up your vendors and processing your vouchers that those flags are set accordingly. And reconciling your Open Accounts Payable to your general ledger, as long as all transactions are made through Accounts Payable and no journal entries are made to your Accounts Payable general ledger account, generally your OpenAP will reconcile to your general ledger. And that concludes our session on accounts payable, soup to nuts. Thank you.